Hi there, podcast and public radio fans. Heath Drusen here, host and creator of the Extremely American podcast. I'm working on season 3, which is an urgent story about neo-Nazi terrorists and how they helped build a modern white supremacist movement, even from prison. Some of their ideas have even made it to today's White House. It's both a gripping true crime story and a timely warning about threats to our democracy. And this time, my investigative reporting is funded by you. To support the project, please make a tax-deductible contribution at extremelyamerican.org. That's extremelyamerican.org. And thanks.
More Idaho Matters from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudette. More than $8 million. That's how much the Bryan Kohberger case has cost the state of Idaho so far. Kohberger is in prison after pleading guilty to the murder of 4 University of Idaho students in Moscow. He pleaded guilty last summer. And the Idaho Statesman has been investigating the cost of the case, including the $5.5 million spent on his defense. Kevin Fixler is an investigative reporter with the Idaho Statesman. He's been following the Kohberger case from the very beginning. Kevin, nice to have you back on the show.
Yeah, good afternoon, Gemma.
So, Bryan Kohberger pleaded guilty back last July, I believe. So there was never a trial. So where has the money been spent? Can you break down some of the costs for us?
Sure thing. We have to remember that this case took almost 3 years to get from the beginnings of the investigations. The murders occurred in November of 2022. It took 7 weeks to find the perpetrator, arrest him in Pennsylvania, extradite him back to Idaho, and there are a lot of costs associated with that in those first 7 weeks. And then you have these months and months of pretrial proceedings and lockup where Kohberger had no bond and was in custody in Latah County, later in Ada County when we had the change of venue. So all this compiles. The Idaho State Police spent almost $370,000 in additional overtime for its troopers to be involved in helping to patrol the campus. You had Moscow Police. They had over 600 hours of overtime over the course of this. But the big ticket numbers that I think people will be interested in is Latah County spent $3.1 million over the course of this stretch. The State Public Defender's Office contributed $2.7 million itself. And then you had the University of Idaho took a significant brunt of financially from this too, about $1.7 million. So those are kind of the highlights of a lot of the reporting I've done.
So you reported, and I mentioned this, $5.5 million was spent on Kohberger's defense. Was that all legal fees, or what does that look like?
To be honest, we don't know. And that's actually kind of another focus of the story I wrote for the Statesman is that there is a sealed civil case file that's attached to the criminal case for Bryan Kohberger's prosecution. And essentially, the original judge in this case, to avoid any sort of conflict, appoints a different judge to the case to manage the spending by the defense. And this individual, they refer to it as a money or a resource judge, then works through public costs with Kohberger's defense team, and they have to justify, hey, we spent this on this expert, or we need this expert, and this is what this costs, or we want to pay this investigator, or these are our legal fees. So it all sits in this sealed case file that the Statesman is currently litigating over, and it's a case about to go before the Idaho Supreme Court to get access to that file. But we know that it's the $5.5 million are the expenses of the defense over the totality of the case, including some runoff into the months after Kohberger pleaded guilty and was sent to prison.
And this isn't the only high-profile murder case that we saw in recent years in Idaho. In fact, Kevin, in your reporting, you compared the cost of this case with the Daybell murder trials. How much did those cost in comparison?
Yeah, it's not quite an apples to apples comparison because so Lori Vallow Daybell, she had a separate case from her husband, Chad Daybell, and she had a public defender. So that one's a little bit closer. And then Chad Daybell actually had a private attorney. So we can't quite make that exact comparison. And then, of course, in the Kohberger case, we had no trial. What I do know is that East Idaho News at that time reported that the combined investigation, which lasted roughly 3 years investigating Lori and Chad, was about $3.6 million. And then when they split those cases, the Post-Register then later reported that Lori's individual murder trial cost the state $1.8 million. So
Wow.
we can assume that the cost would have been even higher in the Kohberger case had it gone to trial.
So I want to go back to what you said about Latah County and the fact that Latah County itself spent $3.1 million.
Mhm.
Kevin, I mean, who pays that bill? I mean, I am assuming that Latah County doesn't just have an extra $3 million sitting around.
Unfortunately, they had to. This was considered an extraordinary defense budget. And so at the
Hmm.
time, Latah County set aside $1 million per year in order to shoulder the costs, the extraordinary costs of having to fund Kohberger's defense. So if you'll think back, and if your listeners will remember, the state in the last 2 years transitioned from a county-based public defense system to a state public
Hmm.
defense system, and that established the Idaho State Public Defense Office. So this case kind of overlapped between that period. And Latah County, of that $3.1 million, it was 2.8 million of it was actually tied to the defense specifically for Kohberger. The other costs were expenses for the prosecution, travel, lodging, other expenses for their own experts. But the majority of that 3.1 was to cover Kohberger's defense. And then you fast forward in October of 2024, it switched to that state system. And the state system then covers about 2.65 million. And that's how we get to that overall $5.5 million figure for just the defense. But yes, taxpayers were on the hook for all of this, and the majority, Latah County, covered for Kohberger's defense initially.
Right. Well, and we do need to make it very clear. I mean, our Constitution guarantees that you get defense, right? I mean, and someone, if you cannot afford, an attorney, I mean, taxpayers pay for this. When you have cases like this, I think what you're pointing out, Kevin, is the cost of these cases, right? And because you've said, at least right now, the cost is about $8 million. However, can you walk us through just a little bit more about, why you don't necessarily have an accurate number, because of the fact that some of these cases have been closed? And I've got about 2 minutes left with you, because I find this part of it really interesting, that as taxpayers, we still don't know how much we've actually spent.
The estimates that I have here between the 5.5 for defense and 8 million overall for the case, I believe those to be as accurate as we're ever going to get. The FBI doesn't reveal the numbers or the cost to itself, so that's one thing that's missing here. The case costs more than $8 million. We all know that, but these are the identifiable figures. But to answer your question, the statesman continues to fight in court over obtaining the records in this sealed case file. The district judge assigned to that case actually has awarded those. They've agreed to unseal that case file with some exceptions based on attorney-client privilege, work product, anything that would be sensitive information about Kohberger's medical history or his educational records, which are protected under FERPA. But he has awarded those to us. But in sealed hearings that we were in with our attorney representing the statesman, actually with Ann Taylor, objecting to the release of any of these records, she, on behalf of Kohberger, has now appealed that to the Idaho Supreme Court. They've yet to schedule oral arguments, but we have those forthcoming. And the Idaho Supreme Court justices will actually determine this case a case of first impression and set a new precedent whether or not we have access to these sealed records once the cases are fully adjudicated, which has occurred in this case because Kohberger waived all appeal rights once he pled guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison.
All right. Well, Kevin, I find this fascinating. And of course, as your court case moves through the court system, we'll keep an eye on it as well and have you back on to tell us what ends up happening with that. But thanks for all the reporting you've been doing on this and keeping, taxpayers aware of what's happening. So appreciate your reporting.
Thanks for having me.
We've been talking with Kevin Fixler, investigative reporter with the Idaho Statesman, talking about the cost of the Bryan Kohberger murder case. We'll make sure to link back to Kevin's story on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. You've been listening to the Idaho Matters podcast from Boise State Public Radio. To stay in touch, you can find quick Idaho daily news every morning when you subscribe to the Connector podcast. Find this and other Boise State Public Radio podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.
Love Boise State Public Radio podcasts? They are free to enjoy, but not free to produce. If you can give, your support helps keep shows like Idaho Matters and Scandalize available to everyone. Donate now at boisestatepublicradio.org.